Hello and welcome back to A House Divided, coming to you from Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago. If it's on our shelves, it's history. My name is Bjorn Skaptison, and I am your host for this afternoon's twofer book signing and book discussion program. And I'm going to introduce you to our author in just a moment, Kate Masur. And the books we will be discussing are Until Justice Be Done and They Knew Lincoln. We're going to talk about both of those in just a minute. Until Justice Be Done, America's First Civil Rights Movement from the Revolution to Reconstruction. It was published with a 2021 imprint. Maybe I'll ask you about that. But it is a 2022 book and a candidate, a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in history in 2022. Also a finalist for the Lincoln Prize, and it was awarded the John Now Prize for American Civil War era history, and it is one of National Public Radio's best books of 2021. So we have a lot to talk about when we get Until Justice Be Done. Also this, very important, this is an historic day at A House Divided, because the last time we had a book that was signed directly by the author was March 14th of 2020. And the pandemic was coming down around our ears. And Megan Kate Nelson came here and signed Three-Cornered War. Now, Kate Masur is up there in Northwestern in Evanston, Illinois. So she was able to sign your copy of Until Justice Be Done on the book, on the title page in her hand. That is what you'll get if you order Until Justice Be Done. The cost is $32. You can also order They Knew Lincoln by John E. Washington with a new scholarly introduction, edited by Kate Masur, and that costs $31.95. Order it at the link. It is also signed on the title page by the author. Our author today is Kate Masur, professor of history at Northwestern University, finalist for the Lincoln Prize. She is the author of An Example for All the Land, Emancipation and the Struggle for Equality in Washington, D.C. And then, of course, I told you Until Justice Be Done is an award-winning book, which brings us to our author, Kate Masur. Thank you very much for joining us today on A House Divided.
It's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Sure. Hey, this is the first two-for book event that we've had, certainly in a long time. Maybe back before the pandemic, we may have done one or the other. And so people are going to get a chance to buy both of these books. And then, of course, you have this third book, and other books as well, other writing as well. We've just been discussing it before we started, but there seems to me to be a through line for what you've written so far. And correct me if I'm wrong, but you seem to have an interest in the study of civil rights and equality, but in the 19th century, not the 20th century, which most of us think of the civil rights being a 20th century story. Am I right or really, really wrong?
Oh, you're pretty right. Yeah, I have, since graduate school and for a variety of reasons, kind of got really, really interested in the Reconstruction period in grad school, and have always been interested in questions about race, equality, inequality, the long-term effects of the abolition of slavery, we could say as well. And also African-American history. And so those have taken me into the 19th century, where a lot of really, really important stuff obviously happened.
Yeah, exactly. Well, then let's start out with an elevator pitch for Until Justice Be Done. What drew you to the interest in this first civil rights movement, the struggle for civil rights among African-Americans in the North, distinctive in some ways from the struggle against slavery?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, one way of explaining where this recent book came from, I was finishing up my first book on basically on emancipation and Reconstruction in Washington, D.C. and writing a particular line in the introduction about how the Republicans came into office in 1861 and not only proceeded to, in Congress, not only proceeded to move in the direction of abolishing slavery in the District of Columbia, but also repealing the Black Codes. And these were laws that set up, a set of legal distinctions based on race, and not only created slavery, but also set up special rules for free African Americans. So the point here is, if the Republicans in 1861, 62 had only abolished slavery in DC and left the Black Code standing, all the people who became free as a result of emancipation would still be subjected to these horrible kind of racist laws that made free Black people, second-class citizens. So the question was, how it seemed like there had been no debate in Congress about repealing the Black laws in DC. So there was a fair amount of consensus among Republicans. And my question was, we know more or less the shape of the story of how the Republicans came to be a party that opposed slavery, or at least opposed the extension of slavery. But how did they also become a party that was willing to, at their first opportunity, when it came to Washington, D.C. during the Civil War, how they repealed these anti-Black laws? And so how did that happen? And I felt like we didn't have a good enough account of kind of how the free states before the Civil War were incubators for a series of discussions about the status and rights of free African Americans, and how those actual debates and conflicts in the free states from about the 1830s or even earlier to the end of the 1850s, how those shaped Republican politicians who ended up in office during the Civil War and Reconstruction. So that's part of the question that led me into this book. And, part of the other thing I'll just say is my approach to this was to look at a wide range of different kinds of actors. So this was never going to be a study of, just a couple of leading elite Republicans who then end up in office. It was a study of this as a kind of grassroots discussion, a political discussion that's happening at every level of society, including among not just white people, but among Black people, who often were the leading figures in pushing for measures that would lead to a more racially equitable, culture.
I noticed that, and I was when I read that in the book, I thought of Manisha Sinha's wonderful book, The Slave's Cause, and one of the discoveries, maybe not, shouldn't have been a discovery, but one of the things that Professor Sinha pointed out in The Slave's Cause is that the abolition movement was overwhelmingly led by African American people, and we have studied it as though it were a top-down gift from wealthy, white people. So did you find that that was the cause, or the story in these fights for civil rights among people who were already free, but whose rights were so severely constrained? Was it the Black people that led the cause?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you have to look at it from a realistic historical perspective. So first of all, African Americans, out of a sense of justice and humanity, and the experience of racism, had the strongest, most visceral, most personal critique of racism, more so than most white people, even the most progressive white people, whose lives were not as, directly impacted as African Americans' lives were. So Black people 100% took the intellectual leadership. They were the ones publishing, articles saying this country is not living up to its ideals. They often grabbed onto the Declaration of Independence, the idea that all men are created equal. They cited natural law, the idea that, God or nature made all people equal. They called out white people for their racism. They talked about the injustice of racism. But the other thing is that African Americans were a very small minority of the Northern population, and differing in different states and localities, and tended to be pretty impoverished. And so Black people generally had less access to resources that would allow them to make headway in changing laws. So to give an example, to make, be really concrete, like Ohio and Illinois and Indiana came into the Union as states with these anti-Black laws. So these states abolished slavery, but then passed these laws that explicitly discriminated against free Black people. And it took a long time to kind of create a movement to repeal those laws at the state level. African Americans passionately wanted to repeal the laws, but Black men were not permitted to vote. It was really hard to found a Black newspaper, whereas white newspapers were ubiquitous. So how did Black people get the word out and try to persuade people? So you have these differences in power and differences in access to resources that also affected the shape of the movement.
Right, right. Now, as far as the leaders of the movement were concerned, would we recognize some of their names? Are some of the same people that are in anti-slavery crusaders, also pro-civil rights crusaders?
Yeah, there's overlap, but there are also distinctions. And, one of just to be very clear, there's overlap between the anti-slavery movement and this civil rights movement. But if you're in Ohio or Massachusetts or what have you, the question of slavery is far away from you. You may feel very strongly about it, but you are not right. You are not in a state that can abolish slavery. You're not in a place where you can knock on your neighbor's door and say, hey, why are you still enslaving people? And so when people in those free states turned their attention to how they could make their states better, how they could make their own societies better, that's when they started looking at things like repealing the racist laws of Ohio or protecting the rights of free Black sailors who sailed out of Massachusetts and Boston. So some of the people were the same, but some were different. And, for example, Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison appear in this book. But they're not necessarily the leading figures in this book. And partly because I'm interested in the ways that these folks went into politics. And Garrison famously wasn't that interested in or really opposed going into party politics and trying to take the message into politics. So some of the white people in my book are part of the political anti-slavery movement rather than the Garrisonian side of the anti-slavery movement. Some of the African Americans are just not very well known to history, even though they should be. Here in Chicago, a man named John Jones and his wife, Mary Richardson Jones, who were amazing advocates for the repeal of the Illinois Black laws. A guy named David Jenkins was an important leader in Ohio. And one of the things I hope to deliver in this book is a sense of the richness of the cast of characters in African American history who we can look at here.
Right. And in that, there was a question I wanted to bring up and you just listed 3 states that are very important to your study. And they are all states from, if you go back to the Revolution or the early Republican era, these are all states of the old Northwest. Did you find that the story of the fight for civil rights in the old Northwest, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, is different than, say, New England, or again, places that we've previously considered hotbeds of civil rights movement?
Yeah, one of the things I had to make decisions about in this book is how to capture the diversity of different situations in different free states without boring readers to death or feeling like it's just a catalog or an encyclopedia of like, and in New Jersey this, and in Vermont that.
Yeah.
So I focused a lot on, in the Northeast, I looked a lot at New York and Massachusetts, and in the Midwest, I looked a lot at Ohio and Illinois. And yeah, the Old Northwest, particularly the lower tier of Old Northwest states, so Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois all border on the Ohio River. And Michigan and Wisconsin, which are the other states in the Old Northwest, have some of the features I'm about to describe, but not all of them. These states, the lower Northwest states, were particularly interested in holding on to their racially discriminatory laws because state legislators in those states were many of them tended to worry about Black migration from the slave states across the Ohio River into their states. So while Wisconsin and Michigan became territories with the same kind of racist laws on the books, by the time of statehood, they mostly had gotten rid of them, except for barring Black men from the right to vote. Whereas Ohio, Illinois, and Indiana more or less doubled down on those laws until Ohio, as a result of the pressure and the movement that I talk about in my book, repealed those laws in 1849. So
Right.
then the Old North, oh yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna. Yeah, that brought up the question for me. Are there examples of laws where what would be Black men could vote but had the franchise torn away from them?
Yes, most famously, or the best known example of that is in Pennsylvania, where
Mhm.
African American men. So in the older states that became states around the time of the American Revolution, African American men were enfranchised most of the time, if not all the time, on the same terms as white men. So there just wasn't racial distinctions in the right to vote among men. They might have property qualifications, they might have taxpayer qualifications. They excluded women, except for New Jersey at first, but they did not make race-based distinctions. And then it's these states that come in later. So that's another factor is Ohio comes in 1803. The states that come in after 1800 that are free states impose these racial restrictions on the right to vote. And then some of the older states that didn't used to have racial restrictions on the right to vote implement them. So Pennsylvania is kind of the most egregious because they fully take away the right to vote from African American men in 1835. New York State imposes a property qualification on Black men in 1821, whereas they drop it for white men. So in some places, you see a backward movement, a kind of race-based disenfranchisement, even as white men are more universally enfranchised during this period.
Right, right. Well, your book is, I think one of the wonderful things about it is how it is organized in dealing with geography in a way that makes that geography important. And I appreciate that you decided not to just go, okay, boom, 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 Indiana, blah, blah, blah. But it does make the point that different places are important for their own geographical history. One of them being, because we are at Abraham Lincoln Bookshop, we have, and you've already brought up John Jones and Mary Richardson Jones in chapter 7 is where you talk about that. And also our man, Abraham Lincoln, appears at that time. And so what role, since you're talking to Lincolnians, what role did Lincoln play in the antebellum fight for equal rights in Illinois? Perhaps none at all. And did he know or work with John Jones and Mary Richardson Jones?
It's a great question. And I was really, at one point when I was writing the book, I was trying to decide what chapter 7 was going to do and where to kind of locate it. And when I sort of thought, oh, right, it makes sense to do it in Illinois for all of these reasons. And it was a kind of epiphany, and I'm really glad I did it that way. So because that allows me to have Lincoln come into the book, and then the next chapter, which is kind of the Civil War chapter, has a lot to do with the Lincoln administration, right? And the policies that the Lincoln administration implemented during, 1861 to 1865. So Lincoln, so I'm following, as we get into the part where Lincoln comes into the story, I'm following in some ways, the political anti-slavery movement in these free states, and in terms of white folks, the white people who were most interested in things like repeal of the Black laws. So for Ohio, a great example would be Salmon Chase, who, advocated repeal of the Black laws of Ohio, advocated for Black men's right to vote in Ohio starting in the 1840s. And so when we get to the mid 1850s and the formation of the Republican Party, as probably people listening well know, there are a lot of different kinds of factions that are going to come into the Republican Party in the second half of the 1850s. And Chase and the kind of political anti-slavery people are what we could call, the left side of that coalition. Here in Illinois, Owen Lovejoy is an example of, someone who was very much on the kind of left of these questions. And then Lincoln is really, in the sort of center of these questions. And so there was a movement in Illinois to repeal the Black laws. And one person I learned a lot about, and I'm happy to get to mention this, is Abina Eastman, the editor of the Western Citizen here in Chicago, was a political anti-slavery editor who, was hugely into calling for repeal of the Black laws. In his paper, he published petitions that people could cut out and sign. He worked with African Americans like John Jones or Henry Wagner. This guy, H. Ford Douglass, was another important player in all of this to press the Illinois legislature to repeal the laws. Lincoln never publicly supported repeal of the Black laws. And by the time that he was campaigning for Senate in 1858, and certainly for president, He was, as people have said many times, he was fighting, kind of pushing back against a Democratic Party at the time that was very interested in constantly portraying the Republicans as radicals on race, right? As the next thing you know, you're going to be calling for interracial marriage. Oh my gosh, that's the worst thing I've ever heard. And so without knowing, in a way, or let me just make 2 points. One, I don't know what Lincoln, it's impossible to know what Lincoln would have done about the question of repeal of the Illinois Black laws if he hadn't also been running for office. We don't know in a vacuum, in a kind of pure test situation, what he would have done.
We do know that he had separate personal convictions and political convictions. He was able to draw a line between them.
Yeah. And so the next thing I would say is that I found it very telling to revisit the Lincoln Douglas debates in the context of this book, and to see that, a couple of things come right to mind. Douglas supported the Dred Scott decision. Lincoln spoke out against it instantaneously, as most Republicans did. Stephen Douglas said that the founders of this country said that the country was, when they said all men are created equal, they actually meant all white men are created equal. Lincoln denied that. He said they meant all men, and they meant regardless of race. Lincoln argued that all people were entitled to basic civil rights, as civil rights were understood at the time. Douglas argued that Black people were not entitled to basic civil rights or citizenship. So when we look at the distinction between the two candidates in 1858, we can see that even if Lincoln is not what we would want to see out of somebody like Lincoln, he is drawing a very clear distinction in terms of questions of race and rights between himself and Stephen Douglas. And just the last thing I'll say on that.
Yeah, please.
I found this great source, and I corroborated it as best I could, but there is this Black abolitionist or Black activist named H. Ford Douglass who was quite radical. And H. Ford Douglass went on a speaking tour in 1860, and he was really couldn't stand the Republicans and Lincoln. He thought they weren't radical enough. And he said that he said a couple years earlier, so it might've been 1857 or 58, he had asked both Lincoln and Lyman Trumbull to sign a petition for repeal of the Black laws, and they had refused. And Ford Douglass was using this as an example of why Lincoln wasn't radical enough, and that he wouldn't even stand up for repeal of the Black laws in Illinois. And I was happy to find that source, and I put it in the book. I think it's probably true, but there's no way of verifying it. You could imagine that H. Ford Douglass went up to Lincoln in person and said, "Would you sign this?" And Lincoln said no, or because it allows us to tack between 3 different positions instead of having 2 polar opposites. So we can see H. Ford Douglass, Lincoln, and Stephen Douglas together as a kind of spectrum of possible views on this question. And I just think it's helpful to add that 3rd view of H. Ford Douglass as a way of understanding what the different possibilities for what people could have believed and how they could have approached things at that time.
Right. That's fascinating. And it's great that you were able to find that other perspective. What I wanted to get to here is the second part of my geography question. So we've talked a little about the Northeast, of course, a lot about the Old Northwest, but there's one place that is very distinct in the fight for civil rights, and always has been. It's always been a strange outlier, and that is DC, the District of Columbia. And no matter what we talk about in the rest of the country, things seem to happen differently in the district. So give us a little idea of how these questions of civil rights are working out in the District of Columbia, and why does that become more acutely intense than in other places?
Well, hopefully anybody who's listening is, won't get totally turned off if I say the word federalism, but I mean, I think it's very clear that federalism is like an incredibly important force in American history and in the present, right? That we have states, we have state governments, we have a relationship between state governments and the federal government, but the relative powers of the state and federal government are always being worked out and revised and revisited. And so what DC is that it's not a state. It's the federal district, and the Constitution gives Congress kind of all the power to make policy for the District of Columbia. And we know that now. If you've ever lived in DC, you know that now, because residents of DC are perpetually frustrated that they have no representation or no voting representation in Congress, and yet Congress can kind of impose its will. And, you know, if the majority shifts from Republican to Democrat or vice versa, different policies get kind of inflicted on DC without any kind of input from local people. So that was true going all the way back. And what that meant was that people, you know, and abolitionists kind of developed this very skillfully. They understood that even if they couldn't persuade Congress, well, most people believed that Congress did not have the power to touch slavery in the states where it already existed. So if you were an abolitionist and you wanted the whole country to get rid of slavery, the Constitution just doesn't give Congress that power. It did not until the 13th Amendment was adopted in 1865. And so what can you do at the federal level? You can petition and lobby and argue that Congress should abolish slavery in the District of Columbia, making it a kind of symbol, right, that this is Congress's will and we would do it everywhere else if we had the power to do it. And that's where, of course, the gag rule comes in, right, is that most of the petitions that were flooding into Congress in the 1830s were petitions about DC in one way or another: abolish slavery in the district, abolish the slave trade in the district, you know, to some extent, abolish slavery in federal territories. But all this stuff was like, people understood that Congress only had power over slavery in certain places in the United States, and that's what they were pointing at. And so this stuff about civil rights, or the question of the free rights of free African Americans, plays out similarly, and that's one of the things I write about in my book. But I'll stop because this has been kind of a long answer.
Sure, no, that's but I think that does bring up, because we're going to get to the Civil War and we're going to get to emancipation, where again, the District of Columbia is an incubator for emancipation later.
Right.
Things that happen nationally seem to happen in Washington, D.C. first.
Well, of course, Lincoln had his own proposal for the abolition of slavery in the District of Columbia back in 1849, I think it was. So,
right.
You know, Lincoln himself was involved in that conversation about the possibility that Congress could pass some kind of legislation to abolish slavery in DC.
Now, one of the things I noticed, now I have a question I want to ask, and I'm going to do that the folks watching have, but I want to get this one in first. One of the people you talk about in the Illinois chapter, in the Chicago chapter, is John Logan. And I'm presuming this was John Blackjack Logan, the Democrat, and then later the general in the.
Yeah.
But you had pointed out that Logan was authored an Illinois Black Codes law called the Slave Law, even though it wasn't about slavery, but it did permit some an African-American person who was taken down under a vagrancy law to be sold and compelled to work without pay. And that sort of reminded me, and you say it elsewhere in the book, it reminded me that there are vagrancy laws throughout the country, and that vagrancy laws seem to give a bunch of these states, a bunch of anti-civil rights people in these states, a non-racist excuse for implementing racist laws. Did you find that across the country?
Yeah, what I found in part was that the Midwestern states that we were talking about would build their anti-Black laws, which were explicitly anti-Black, onto their poor law structure. So there were these officers at the county level called the overseers of the poor. They would enforce vagrancy laws and stuff like that. When these states adopted anti-Black laws, they would have the overseers of the poor enforce them. And many of the anti-Black laws were about certain kinds of policies around what was called legal settlement, where the laws made a distinction between people who had a quote unquote settlement in the community and therefore were kind of members of the community and eligible for poor relief if they ever became dependent, versus people who were considered outsiders, deportable, not really belonging. And the way that these laws worked is that they kind of configured Black people as outsiders, as always being like vagrants or outsiders. But then sometimes, as you suggested, there would be an outcry against, well, we can't discriminate based on race, like that's terrible, that's, unfair. So let's just have vagrancy laws that we know we can use to do the same thing that we wanted to anyway. So they would kind of, in ways that seem sometimes strikingly contemporary, they would kind of turn the law to be facially race neutral, but with the intention that it would serve the same purpose of allowing law enforcement officials to kind of do what they wanted in terms of going after people a little, based on race.
Right, exactly. And yeah, I had noticed that for the same reason that you suggested. It seems to be happening, seems to happen in contexts that are not necessarily 19th century history. Now let's get to some of the folks that are asking us questions, because we do have a lot of people watching on our Facebook feed. And if you have any questions to put into that feed, now's a great time to do it, because Kate and I are going to entertain a couple of questions from the audience. So first of all, a few shout outs to the people who are watching. A lot of our favorites. Dave Wiegers is watching from Gurney, and Bill Gorski is out there. Hi, Bill. Ruth Rowley Squillaci is watching from Long Island. Great to see you, Ruth, always is. Although she may be in Gettysburg now. So, because now, of course, you can watch a live stream Facebook event from Little Round Top if that's where you want to be. Mm-hmm. Also, David Kent shouts out, says both books are wonderful. The Until Justice Be Done book was superb. And David is a Lincoln scholar and an author. And you'll probably see him in this space very soon, as early as September, I think. Now, Daniel Weinberg is watching. Dan is up in Highland Park and also has an office right down from me here at Abraham Lincoln Bookshop. Daniel wants to know, Kate, where did the Black abolitionists publish or get out their voices? Were they heard and used by white abolitionists?
Great point. So the first known Black newspaper in the United States is called Freedom's Journal, and it was published in New York City starting in 1829. And I looked a fair amount. I mean, I'm not the first person to notice that or write about Freedom's Journal, but Freedom's Journal partly came into existence because, I mean, some of the Black writers and ministers and people involved in it are on record in other places saying we need a venue to get our views out. We're being misrepresented in white newspapers. The colonization movement was getting underway, and they felt like they needed a place to express that the vast majority of free African Americans did not support colonization. The idea that this white-led movement that free Black people should leave the United States and end up going to Liberia. And so they really were looking for, an outlet, and they started Freedom's Journal to do that. Now, to give an example from Ohio, there was a really phenomenal anti-slavery newspaper out of Cincinnati called The Philanthropist. And The Philanthropist is digitized. And The Philanthropist covered not only what white activists were doing, and the Philanthropists favored repeal of the Ohio Black laws, but also what Black organizers were doing. And I think that just as people have said, or studied that many of the subscribers to Garrison's Liberator newspaper were African-American, so too with the Philanthropists, that there was clearly, it seems like likely that they were writing for partially an African-American audience because they covered Black meetings, certain aspects of like Black church stuff that was going on, just stories in general. And then in Ohio, there are a number of efforts to found newspapers by African Americans. And sometimes you can see there's a short-lived Black newspaper called the Palladium of Liberty, which is quite amazing, published out of Columbus. You can see that the philanthropist sometimes picks up the Palladium of Liberty and vice versa, the stories. So and let me just come back to the Western Citizen in Chicago. Between one thing and another, you can see pieces of the conversation that we know as historians, we can't see the whole thing. The Western Citizen has just been digitized by the Illinois Newspapers Project. And when I was doing this research, I thought the philanthropist out of Cincinnati was amazing. And the Western Citizen was not digitized at that time. It was on microfilm at the Abraham Lincoln Library, at the Chicago Historical Society. And through the efforts of folks at University of Illinois, they now have just finished a digitization project to digitize that paper. And I'm saying this now, I mean, there's going to be, I'll be sending around information about it. And I think other people will too. It really hasn't been announced very much until now, but there's a huge amount of information about the history of African Americans in Illinois and Southern Wisconsin that's kind of untapped because people haven't fully, kind of utilized that paper in a way that will be possible now because of the digitization. Wow,
that's great. That's great news. And then we have Lisa Davidson. And Lisa has a question similar to one that you've already entertained, Kate, but I want to share it in case you want to develop the answer anymore. Lisa says, great books and a great conversation. A question, what, if any, was the relationship between John Jones and Lincoln?
Yeah, I didn't find a relationship between them, to be honest. I mean, I didn't find any evidence. I mean, it's a good segue to talking about They Knew Lincoln if we want to do that. But actually, I mean, the more I found out about John Jones, by the time Lincoln was president, Jones was really involved, I mean, long before Lincoln was president, in this movement to repeal the Black laws. When the Illinois legislature finally repeals them in the winter of 1865, Jones was there. He went to Springfield as a lobbyist sent by Black organizations in Chicago and went and stood at the door of the Illinois legislature and tried to, tell people how much it mattered to, how much it mattered for African Americans in Illinois to repeal these laws. So I think Jones was very involved in state level politics in the 1860s, and where Lincoln, was by that time the president on the national scale.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, everybody that is contributing from the live stream. Thank you, Lisa and Daniel and David and Bill and Ruth and David. So great to have you here. Yes, let's do segue into They Knew Lincoln, because there's so much great stuff to talk about in this book. And I need to start by simply speaking on behalf of Lincoln fans, Lincolnians, which includes everybody watching, and say, thank you, Kate, for bringing this book back into print. This is really one of the great books in Lincoln historiography. And this one, the original edition from 1942 with introduction by Carl Sandburg, is really hard to find. And we can talk about that because this is actually a book where the story about getting it published twice is a very interesting story. But we will also get in between the covers as well and talk about it. Tell us a little bit about John Washington. Why do we need to remember John Washington as one of the great scholars of 20th century scholars of Lincoln?
John Washington was, a really interesting, multi-talented person. And when I first started doing research, when I first got interested in this book, I was in grad school, and it was actually kind of before there was a lot of stuff on the internet. And I remember at one point, doing like a search, trying to figure out, John E. Washington, okay, who is this guy? And if you did a Google search on him now, you would find a lot of stuff, probably including this book and stuff from this book. But Back then, it was hard to figure out very much about him at all. He was born in 1880. He was African-American, born in Annapolis, Maryland, and raised by his grandmother in Washington, D.C. in the neighborhood of Ford's Theater. He got 3 degrees from Howard University. So he first got a teaching degree, then a degree in dentistry, and then went back and got a bachelor's degree. And he taught in the segregated Washington, D.C. public schools. He had been artistic from the time he was a child, and so he ended up teaching graphic art and industrial art. He was also a pioneer of Black dentistry. There weren't that many African-American dentists in that era. Howard University was one of the few places that trained African-American dentists. And so he belonged to a Black Dentists Association, and he practiced dentistry probably out of his home while also working as a teacher in the public schools. And then in addition, had a lifelong fascination with Abraham Lincoln and the history of the Civil War years, which was connected to his interest in the history of African Americans and emancipation. And in the 1930s, as I write about in the introduction to, or my introduction to the book, he gets really interested in Elizabeth Keckley, who worked for Mary Lincoln. And from there, through a variety of different turns of events, ends up writing They Knew Lincoln, which was published in 1942.
Right. So, okay, then let's get into They Knew Lincoln. Why? What is this book about, and why does it hold this important place in Lincoln historiography? Because prior to John Washington, certainly William Herndon, who wanted to collect everybody who knew Lincoln, had found a way to leave out anybody who was African American.
Well, you just said it. I mean, so this is the first book length treatment of Lincoln's relationship to African Americans. And it's about a lot more than that too, actually. And it's certainly the case, as you said. I mean, Herndon went about trying to collect all these stories of Lincoln soon after Lincoln died, and from all of these people who knew Lincoln. And yet Herndon doesn't seem to have solicited information from anybody who was African American. And that's really stunning to me, actually. I mean, people often have said to me, like, well, Herndon was more of an abolitionist than Lincoln was. And it's like, well, maybe so, but like there is a guy named William de Florvie, who was Lincoln's barber in Springfield, who was an immigrant from Haiti to the United States, a guy who's incredibly well documented in the historical records because he advertised his barbershop in Springfield newspapers. He wrote poetry. He was a musician. He was a philanthropist. It's not hard to find out about William de Florvie or Florville. But, and he is a contemporary of Herndon, who Herndon would have known. There's no doubt. And yet he didn't even interview Florville, right? I mean, and so and the more I worked on They Knew Lincoln and kind of read and reread some of the material, the more I thought that Washington was kind of directly addressing what Herndon had failed to do. There were a few places in the book where he seemed to kind of implicitly cite Lincoln. Herndon, I think there's one place where he says, Lincoln's understanding of slavery and African Americans came not from a visit to New Orleans, but from his intimate knowledge of Black people who worked for him, who he lived alongside. And, Herndon is kind of the source, if I'm not mistaken, of that story of Lincoln going to New Orleans and being horrified by slavery. So in any event, what John Washington faced in the 1930s was obviously a really different situation from what Herndon had faced, because it was decades later. And so he was going around trying to reconstruct some of the same kinds of materials that Herndon would have produced. That is to say, oral history, interviews, talking to people about their recollections of Lincoln, trying to find scraps of paper, like anything that remained that would be African Americans' reflections on Lincoln, or on Lincoln's reflections on specifically on African Americans. It's unfortunate and tragic that he was doing this in the second half of the 1930s, so much later than Lincoln had been alive. But on the other hand, we're so lucky that he did it at all, because there are stories in this book from elderly people or even the children of people who had known Lincoln that are really interesting and that wouldn't have been preserved at all if Washington hadn't done this work.
Right, right. And he uses family history to some extent. You mentioned that. But one of the reasons why you hinted at this, but I think it's a really interesting story. One of the reasons why a dentist decided it was time to write a book about African Americans and Abraham Lincoln had to do with a 1930s era sort of cultural attempt to sort of erase Elizabeth Keckley from the record. And so here's Washington sitting in his office or in his home, suddenly realizing that if no one corrects this, Elizabeth Keckley is just going to disappear. Someone's going to try to do. Tell us a little bit about that story, because I think that is such an interesting story about why Washington decided, I have to write this book.
Yeah, it is a really interesting story in its own right. So a writer, he was a kind of political gadfly and also writer on Lincoln, who was, I think, perennially writing a book about Lincoln's assassination that was never published, named David Rankin Barbie, said publicly in an article published in it was an article published in the Washington Evening Star that was part of the AP, so it went out in the across the Associated Press wires. Was actually a woman journalist named Bess Furman was doing a story on historic women reporters. Okay, that's where it started, and like the history of women newspaper reporters. And Barbie said, "Oh yeah, and Jane Grace Swisshelm, another Lincoln contemporary who's from Minnesota, she was the actual author of Behind the Scenes, what is known as Elizabeth Keckley's book." Well, this white woman wrote it, this white reporter wrote it. And actually Elizabeth Keckley, never didn't write it and never existed at all. This Barbie said. And so Bess Furman just put that in her story. And so when John Washington read the story that, was part of the story about Jane Swisshelm, saying that Elizabeth Keckley didn't write Behind the Scenes, which is, of course, as everyone knows in this room, Elizabeth Keckley's memoir of her life and of knowing the Lincolns and being in the Lincoln White House, and particularly her relationship with Mary Lincoln, that she not only didn't write the book, but also didn't actually exist, and the entire thing had been written by Jane Swisshelm. John Washington said, this is bananas. Like, we can't let him say this, and we need to protect and elevate the legacy of Elizabeth Keckley. And at that time, some African Americans in DC who had known Keckley were still alive. And so he was like, he wrote a letter to the editor. He called David Barbie. He wrote a letter that was published in the Evening Star saying, all you have to do is go talk to some Black people and you will find out that Elizabeth Keckley surely did exist. Mm-hmm. And it was interesting because this is the kind of thing that's like a historian's dream in a way. It turned out that Bess Furman's papers are at the Library of Congress in the reading room. And I went and looked at her papers, and she had kept a diary, like a kind of daily work diary. Mm-hmm. And she went and talked to Washington, and then she went and talked to a couple of people that Washington sent her to. And then she wrote a follow-up story that said, like, oh, actually, lots of people know that Elizabeth Keckley actually existed. And she didn't call it a correction in her story, but in her diary, she wrote correction to the Keckley story. Okay. So it was a thing. And this is what got Washington onto the track of, at first, what he wanted to do was publish a pamphlet on Keckley and Keckley's life. And then he expanded that into a whole book on African Americans in Lincoln.
Mm-hmm. And because we are talking about it, there's a first edition of Behind the Scenes. And certainly if anybody was going to make up a fictional woman, they would also have to make up a portrait of her and have it engraved for the frontispiece of a book that was published by G.W. Carleton and Publishers, and thousands of it went out. But this was just something that you see happening in the 20th century, if the voice is a woman or an African-American person, you'll probably find other examples of that. Oh, well, the voice doesn't mean that much, or they didn't say that much. Oh, well, by the way, they never existed at all.
Yeah.
This
I
is
mean,
probably
and so
not the only example of that.
right. And this is a very, transparent, traceable example of someone's effort to make sure that didn't happen. Right. To
Right.
kind of, and I mean, one of the things that's in this book, of the many things that are in the book, John Washington, living in Washington, D.C., and being a creative and enterprising researcher, he would go to the pension bureau. So the pension records had not been turned over. I believe the pension records hadn't been turned over to the National Archives yet. So he would go to the pension bureau, go to the Treasury Department, and ask the people who work there, can you pull up these records for me? And so he published in the book, among other things, a facsimile of Keckley's application for a pension because her son had died in the war. He actually had enlisted in a white regiment and he was killed very early on. And so she filed for a pension, and in that, sworn affidavit, basically, in which she filed for a pension, she said many of the things about her life that were also in the memoir. So what Washington was trying to do in the case of Keckley and others was corroborate, or in the case of Keckley in particular, is corroborate stuff that she said to help people understand that there's a lot that's credible and reliable about the book behind the scenes, in addition to the fact that Keckley, existed as a human being.
Right.
Yeah.
And I was going to say that you've already sort of brought it up, but the appendices to Washington's book are very important. And I think I'm going to go ahead and ask my question, but you answered it to some extent. Why did Washington feel it was important to include such detailed historiographical information, the nuts and bolts of how he got there,
Yeah, I mean, so if you look at the book, in the appendix are a lot of facsimiles of documents, and he was fighting against, misinformation, basically. And he was fighting to put Black history on the record. In some ways he was fighting kind of against people who would erase Elizabeth Keckley, or who would say there's nothing to say, nothing to see here, or like, we can't possibly, find this history, it's all evaporated. And he was sort of putting the documents in and saying, look, they are here, and people can find them. And I think he was also, in doing that, establishing his credibility as an African-American historian, in the context of the fact that, well, he didn't have a PhD, he was Black. And so people would also, many white readers and white people in the Lincoln field, quite frankly, would be more likely to doubt the reliability of his text. So he's also trying to show that he is doing a very careful job in the research that he's doing, and that people should believe him.
Right. And let's look at the original publication, because this is a very scarce book. But in the original publications, you talk about it in your new introduction, which is why you need to have both books, folks at home. But Washington had two important white advocates speaking for him in order to try to get this book published. Maybe he could have done it without them, maybe not. Maybe more copies would have been printed. But of course, there's Carl Sandburg, who wrote the introduction, who took your job for the first edition, and then also a scholar who was known as the dean of Lincoln Studies at the time, James Randall at University of Illinois, was behind. He blurbed for this, and there's also a story about Randall helping it get out, or maybe printing more copies than would otherwise have been printed. And here's where I want to let you actually get into the nuts and bolts. We don't have a ton of time. If you want to get into the nuts and bolts of publishing, that's a story I like to hear, about how this book came to be. What's Sandburg's role? What's Randall's role? What did Washington feel about those guys?
Yeah, and it's probably a bigger, read the introduction, buy the book.
Yeah, buy this book. You need this book.
But I mean, you put yourself in the shoes of John Washington, or, try to. I mean, he's a very, very well-educated African-American man born in 1880, lives in DC. He's a frequenter of the Library of Congress reading room. And how do you persuade a New York publisher to publish your book on African Americans in Lincoln, right? And he clearly felt that he needed an introduction. He needed a literary agent. He didn't have those things at the beginning of the project. He wasn't very well connected in the Lincoln world. He wrote a lot of letters to people in the world of Lincoln collecting that helped him get introduced to those folks who actually were interested, for the most part, in helping him find sources and stuff like that. And so his agent ended up being a guy named Volta Parma, who was the manuscript reading room librarian at the Library of Congress and served as his literary agent in a relationship that seemed to work at first, but then kind of go sour. And then Parma died of a heart attack right before the book came out. But backtracking for a second from that, Washington had met Randall, Professor James Randall, in the manuscript reading room as well. And, kind of struck up a conversation, as I'm sure these men, would do. And so Washington asked Randall to read the first chapter that he wrote, and then they kind of struck up a correspondence. And James Randall did support publication of the book and helped get Carl Sandburg to write the intro, and also helped run interference with the publisher at a certain point when there was some tension around the editing of the book. But Randall also said some things kind of to other people about how he thought the book was, he characterized the book as folklore and kind of thought of John Washington as a kind of authentic voice of a Black person, a kind of untrained voice that was more quaint and folkloric than historical. And the way that he wrote about Washington to other people was sometimes, like, in my view, like very patronizing and very much putting him in a box of a certain kind of writer, certain kind of Black writer that was less than compared to people with PhDs, white professors, right, things like that. And Randall, as far as I understand from reading about him, was very committed to the development of expertise, professional, quote unquote, professional PhD type expertise in the field of Lincoln studies. So it was part of Randall's kind of worldview too, that there was a very strict line between the real history professors and the amateurs. And he certainly saw Washington as an amateur in a racialized way. But that being said, and we have to hold these two things in our minds at the same time, I think Randall really did help Washington get the book published. Washington expressed a lot of gratitude to Randall for that. And, if Washington needed some of these kind of prominent people in the Lincoln field to get his book published by Dutton.
Right. Now, and just for the story behind that, for those of you that collect the antiquarian books, They Knew Lincoln is a very scarce book, published in 1942. There's a lot of reasons why it might be scarce. In a different conversation, you and I discussed what was during World War II, and they didn't print many copies of books during World War II. We needed paper. But also you notice here that this is the one we're selling is the second printing. I'm going to hold the slug up there to the camera. And sure, as a book dealer, I can tell you, this is a scarce book to begin with. Even if you can get that second printing, if you get one of those that just says first printing with no, that's rare. I don't know where they went, but to find a real first edition of this, first state of the first edition of this is quite rare and valuable. Which is why, Kate, for the readers out there, it is quite valuable that you have brought They Knew Lincoln back to press. And now they can buy it from us for $31.95, get an updated introduction, more scholarly than Carl Sandburg was able to get you. This is a wonderful book, and I think people should add it to their bookshelf. We're about out of time, Kate, but did you have anything that you would either want to say to put a bow on They Knew Lincoln, which we're offering for sale right now, but also to let folks know Until Justice Be Done, the importance of this story?
Thanks for the opportunity to say something. I mean, I guess I'll just say one quick thing about Until Justice Be Done. We mentioned this, but there is a whole chapter on Lincoln's presidency, and really the stuff, the material we were talking about earlier about the antebellum years and kind of how this movement developed. The culmination of the book is in those last two chapters, where I write about how the Lincoln administration implemented some of their ideas about racial equality before the law in the places where they thought they constitutionally could do so during the war. And then the final chapter that talks about how those ideas made their way into the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment is very much in the news right now. And so, there's some current resonances with the discussions that I'm talking about in the book to present day questions. So I'll leave it there.
And then, of course, one of the things I noted with the original state, multiple states of an important book, another important book that we're talking about does have multiple states for collectors. First thing to know about Until Justice Be Done, as you said, if you're out there watching this, it is a Lincoln book. It is a Civil War book. Let's not put that silo on top of it and pretend that a book about African Americans in the North fighting for their civil rights from the revolution is somehow not something else other than a Civil War or a Lincoln book. This needs to be on a Lincoln bookshelf. Also, people at home need to know that this Pulitzer Prize finalist book in history can be acquired in the first edition, sometimes with a sticker that tells you it is a Pulitzer Prize finalist, and sometimes without. And this is a long story that I'm not going to tell in this live stream, except to tell you that when commerce gets a hold of a great book, they create what is known in the collecting world as different states. You can have a first edition, you can have a second edition, you can have a first edition first state of this collectible signed Pulitzer Prize finalist book. But if you wait too long, you're going to end up with a sticker on your dust jacket and get a second state. And that is going to be, that's an important thing in the history of publishing. So congratulations, your book is now important in the history of publishing, Kate.
I'm amazed. I like the sticker. I kind of like the second state.
Some people might decide they want the second state because it tells you right up front. It's a Pulitzer Prize finalist for which you deserve congratulations, Kate Masur. Thank you very much for joining us on A House Divided. Let me very quickly tell those at home what we have coming up in our next episode. It will be Thursday, July 7th at 3:30 in the afternoon. Dr. Timothy B. Smith will be returning to A House Divided with the early struggles for Vicksburg, the Mississippi Central Campaign, and Chickasaw Bayou, October 25th through December 31st, 1862. You're going to see an email about that. We're going to return to traditional military history of the Vicksburg Campaign for your next book. Once again, Kate Masur, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
And for the rest of you, we will see you next time on A House Divided.